Richard Wagner's The Ring of Nibelung is perhaps one of the most famous and culturally significant musical works ever written. 4 different parts consisting of over 15 hours of music and written in the span of more than 2 decades, the impact of Wagner's Ring was monumental. Monumental as well as familiar. The work is famous for its display of ancient Norse myths as well as interpretation of the medieval sagas, combined and turned to music within the context of 19th century Germany and the soon emerging and ever rising United German State. Wagner, through his compositions, became famous throughout Europe, and Tolkien himself was documented to have been at least somewhat familiar with his work, and specifically the Ring cycle itself. This fact, in combination with some similarities between Wagner's Ring and the Lord of the Rings, has led to speculation that Tolkien was deeply inspired by Wagner's work, speculation and accusation that Tolkien himself addressed head-on. Before we get into Tolkien's words, however, which may have been biased, let us see for ourselves the connection between Wagner's Ring and the Lord of the Rings. If a single word was used to describe the Ring, that word would be epic. If 2 words, then a Germanic epic. Already from the get-go, we encounter a term often used to describe the Lord of the Rings, when it comes not only to its scale and spiritual majesty, but also its deeply rooted Germanic and Norse inspiration. This by itself, so far at least, means nothing of course. Moving past their scale and overall aesthetic and even archaic feeling, however, both works, and especially when including The Hobbit instead of just The Lord of the Rings, also happen to feature hoards of treasure, greedy dwarven craftsmen, mighty warriors, heroes and dragons, wise and divinely powered old men, as well as heroic sacrifice for the salvation of the world. Well, still we don't have much to go on, as these things are not specific or unique enough to not only imply inspiration, but an outright copying of Wagner's work on the part of Tolkien. This is, until we finally talk about the actual ring that this 4-part opera cycle is named after, the Ring of the Nibelung. Once you add into this epic, medieval and Germanic story also a quest about a golden ring that wields incredible power and can decide the fate of the world, a ring that corrupts its wearer and turns them into misery and destruction, every other similarity mentioned so far starts to fall into place behind this massive one. The ring that is so central to Wagner's story is what almost exclusively drives the plot forward. Everyone either wants it for themselves, or, as an exception, destroy it for the salvation of the world. Wotan, or Odin, who is the leader of the gods, is after the ring in order to gain enough power to save his realm. The pursuit of the ring, however, is the very thing that sets in motion the events that lead to the destruction of the gods in the first place. Wagner's ring represents an unnatural force of corruption that causes conflict in everything it touches, without question. And the story of this epic culminates, as you may have already guessed, in the destruction of the ring in its birthplace, which restores the natural order and saves the world, though not without leading to the destruction of the gods and the end of their age. In the end, within Wagner's ring, what we see is an all-consuming darkness that exists without exception. Almost none can escape its curse and its reach, and it is utterly unavoidable, conquered only by the unrelenting love and sacrifice of Brunhilde. On the surface at least, what we have already seen so far are 2 pieces of work that feature an incredibly similar and unique plot device in the form of their own corrupting golden rings, within the context of largely mythological, Germanic and Norse influenced stories. All of these little things, alongside the larger factor that is the ring, combined are what have led people to accuse or speculate, even in Tolkien's own time, that the professor had been heavily inspired from what ultimately became Wagner's classic. Now, with possible coincidences in mind, such as the One Ring similarity to Plato's Ring of Gyges, a ring that turns its wearer invisible, what did Tolkien himself say about the similarities between himself and Wagner? In Letter 229, written in 1961 to his publishers in Allen and Unwin, Tolkien addresses a Hallmark's introduction included to the Swedish translation of The Lord of the Rings. The ring is in a certain way Der Nibelungenring. Both rings were round, and there their resemblance ceases, which was originally forged by Volund, the master smith, and then by way of Vitka and Vare passed through the hands of the mighty Aesir into the possession of Hreidmar and the dragon, after the dragon's fall coming to Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, after his murder by treacherous conspirators coming to the Burgundians, after their death in Alte's snake pit coming to the Huns, then to the sons of Jonekr, to the Gothic tyrant Ermanric, etc. Thank heaven for the etc. I began to fear that it would turn up in my pocket. Evidently Dr. O thinks that it is in his, but what is the point of all this? Those who know something about the Old Norse side of the Nibelung traditions, mainly referred to since the name forms used are Norse, will think this is a farrago of nonsense. Those who do not will hardly be interested. But perhaps they're also meant to conclude that Dr. O also has Master's Cap. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the Lord of the Rings. As for Wayland Smith being a pantype or being reflected both in Bombadil and in Gollum, this is sufficient example of the silly methods and nonsensical conclusions of Dr. O. He is welcome to the rubbish, but I do not see that he, as a translator, has any right to unload it here. As you can see, Tolkien was very upset, finishing the letter by saying that, "Why should I be made an object of fiction while still alive?" As you can also see, Tolkien vehemently opposed any sort of inspiration or even just resemblance between Wagner's ring and his own One Ring, beyond the shapes of the two objects. Considering how upset he was overall, partly also due to the rest of the introduction as well, let us explore in detail the thematic differences between the works, as well as their inspirations. While creating Middle Earth, Wagner's operas had already been quite popular for decades. This makes easy the assumption that if similarities exist, they must come from Tolkien to Wagner. In actuality, however, considering Tolkien's perceived negative opinion of the composer, what is more likely, in my opinion, is that these two men were simply inspired by the same ancient Norse sources. Wagner's Ring, specifically, drew significant inspiration from the 13th century epic German poem, the Nibelungenlied, which included stories of noble ladies, dragons, heroic quests, and mighty warriors. It is said to have been inspired by even earlier sagas of the ancient Norse, notably found, in later forms, within the Eddas. Tolkien himself is said to have read these stories as a child, and especially the tale of Sigurd and the dragon Fafnir, as documented in the sagas, and these are what inspired him the most when forming Middle Earth in his head for the first time. From this, it is easy to assume that, at least partly, Tolkien was not so much inspired by Wagner, whom he disliked, but rather both Tolkien and Wagner were inspired by the same tales. This is the root cause of the familiar aesthetics, epic and somewhat archaic feeling, and certain plot points, which nonetheless, if you delve deeper, you'll find to be quite different from Wagner's. After all, within the center of the Lord of the Rings we have brotherhood, faith, friendship, humility, sin, and the fight against it. While love, sacrifice, and greed play an important role within the Ring, Tolkien's other values, in my opinion, are not as present. If Tolkien was inspired, he certainly gave it his own unique interpretation, an interpretation that came from deep within. Now, when it comes to the two rings, you can find mention of different types of rings, both literal and figurative, within the old sagas. And not only that, but if you research the history behind the development of Middle Earth, you would soon learn that the One Ring in The Hobbit was originally just a little magic ring, a trinket. Tolkien later wished to connect his stories and find an instrument through which to tell his tales of greed and corruption, and he edited newer editions of The Hobbit to make Bilbo's ring the One Ring, and turned that into the literary device that he was searching for. Magical artifacts played a central role in all of the stories that he loved, such as the Kalevala, and what a more convenient artifact for the story that he wanted to tell than a simple, innocent golden ring, the ultimate object of deception. Therefore, what helped in his decision, considering that he was writing the requested Hobbit sequel, was that a golden ring already existed in The Hobbit, and all that was left to do was change the riddles in the dark chapter of the book to fit the narrative of The Lord of the Rings. Considering how unlikely it is that the original Hobbit ring was in any way connected to Wagner, at least some ground must be given to Tolkien. Beyond these out-of-text factors, I also find the two rings to be, ultimately, not as similar as they seem. Wagner's ring is the ultimate corruption of power, yes, but it doesn't extend much beyond that. It is a cursed ring that people are after for its power, but which corrupts because of the curse itself. The One Ring, on the other hand, corrupts because of power itself, because of greed itself, because of sin itself as a part of the human condition. It isn't a curse that makes it this way, but simply what it is and what it promises to provide. The curse lies not within the ring, but within humanity, even regardless of Sauron's role in it. Nonetheless, through the One Ring, our characters are presented a challenge, the ultimate moral test, and it is upon their capacity to overcome their very human nature that the entire story relies upon. Hope. The hope that humanity, even the weakest among us, can rise and be the ones that save the world. That is what Tolkien's Ring and The Lord of the Rings is about, and therein lies their thematic difference, regardless of Tolkien's own words and the historical record. Thus, to conclude, it is my opinion that Tolkien and Wagner were inspired by the same material, which led them to similar creative decisions that did not delve particularly deeper than that, which, in combination with Tolkien's rejection of Wagner's Ring, seems to answer the original premise of the video. Nonetheless, it should be mentioned that Wagner had become increasingly controversial due to his anti-Semitic views, following his popularity with German National Socialists in the 1930s and 40s, which may have been a contributing factor to Tolkien distancing himself from Wagner. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.